The archaeologist who uncovered a 30-year-old murder, the Rebecca Morrison case. The morning sun cast long shadows across the ancient stones of St. Bartholomew's Monastery ruins. Dr. Helena Whitmore brushed dirt from her knees as she stood up from the excavation pit, her back aching from hours of careful digging. The medieval site had yielded fascinating artifacts over the past 3 months: pottery shards, religious medallions, and bone fragments that told the story of monks who had lived here 6 centuries ago. "Another beautiful day in paradise," muttered her assistant, James Crawford, as he photographed their latest find, a carved stone cross that had emerged from the earth like a sleeping memory. Helena smiled despite her fatigue. At 38, she had spent 15 years uncovering the past, but this dig felt special. The monastery had been lost to history until a local farmer discovered the foundation stones while expanding his field. Now, Helena's team from Cambridge University was piecing together the daily lives of the Benedictine monks who had called this place home. The sound of metal striking something solid echoed from the far corner of the excavation site. Helena looked up to see Oliver Hartwell, their newest volunteer, standing frozen over his assigned square. "Dr. Whitmore," Oliver called, his voice tight with confusion. "You need to see this." Helena walked over, her boots crunching on the gravel pathways they had laid between the dig squares. Oliver, a retired teacher who volunteered on weekends, was pointing at something in the soil with his trowel, but he hadn't touched it. "I was following the foundation line like you showed me," he said. "But this doesn't look right." Helena knelt beside the excavation square and peered into the shallow depression Oliver had been working. At first, she saw only dark earth and scattered stones. Then her trained eye caught something that made her stomach clench. A piece of blue fabric protruded from the soil. Not the rough wool or linen she would expect from medieval times, but something synthetic. Something modern. "Step back, Oliver," she said quietly. "James, bring the camera." Helena took out her finest brush and began to carefully expose more of the fabric. Within minutes, she had uncovered enough to see a corner of what appeared to be a denim jacket. Her hands trembled slightly as she continued working. "Helena." James approached with the camera, then stopped short when he saw her face. "What is it?" "Call the police," she whispered. "Right now." As James fumbled for his phone, Helena continued her delicate excavation. More fabric emerged, and then something that made her heart race, a glimpse of white beneath the denim. Not bone that had been buried for centuries, but something else entirely. She had found human remains before. Medieval graves were common at monastery sites. But this was different. This was wrong. The fabric was too new, too well preserved. And as she carefully brushed away more soil, she could see the unmistakable glint of metal. A zipper, still intact after decades underground. "Police are on their way," James said, returning to her side. "Helena, what are we looking at here?" She sat back on her heels, staring at the partially exposed remains. "We're looking at a crime scene, James. Someone who's been buried here for maybe 20 or 30 years. Someone who was never meant to be found." Oliver had gone pale. "You mean a murder?" Helena nodded grimly. In the Middle Ages, monks were buried in simple shrouds or their religious habits. They didn't wear denim jackets. She stood up and began placing orange cones around the excavation square. "From now on, nobody touches anything. We wait for the police." The sirens arrived 20 minutes later, cutting through the peaceful countryside like a knife. Helena watched as 2 patrol cars and an unmarked sedan pulled up beside their site trailer. She had worked with police before when human remains were discovered, but this felt different. This felt personal. A tall man in his early 40s stepped out of the unmarked car. His dark hair was graying at the temples, and his weathered face suggested someone who had seen more than his share of human tragedy. He wore a rumpled suit that had seen better days, but his eyes were sharp and alert. "Dr. Whitmore?" He extended his hand. Detective Inspector Marcus Thornfield, Cambridgeshire Police. I understand you found something unusual. Helena shook his hand, noting the firm grip and direct gaze. That's an understatement, Detective. Follow me. She led him to the excavation square, explaining the monastery's history and their archaeological work as they walked. Thornfield listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding or asking brief clarifying questions. When they reached the site, Thornfield crouched beside the exposed remains and studied them for several long minutes. Helena found herself impressed by his careful attention to detail. He didn't rush to judgment or immediately start barking orders. The preservation is remarkable, he said finally. How deep was this buried? About 3 feet, Helena replied. The soil composition here is quite stable, lots of clay, which acts as a natural preservative. Thornfield stood up and looked around the site. Have you found anything else unusual? Any other areas that seem disturbed? Helena shook her head. We've been working systematically, following standard archaeological protocols. This is the first modern intrusion we've encountered. I'll need to call in our forensic team, Thornfield said. This area will have to be treated as a crime scene until we know more. I'm afraid your archaeological work will have to stop for now. Helena had expected this, but it still stung. 3 months of careful excavation would have to be put on hold while the police investigated a crime that was decades old. How long do you think? She began. Hard to say. Thornfield interrupted gently. Could be days, could be weeks. But Dr. Whitmore, I'll need your expertise. You understand this site better than anyone, and your archaeological skills might be exactly what we need to process this properly. Helena felt a spark of interest despite the circumstances. You want me to work with your forensic team? If you're willing. This isn't just about recovering evidence. It's about understanding how and when this person was buried here. Your knowledge of soil layers, preservation conditions, and excavation techniques could be invaluable. Within an hour, the quiet monastery site had been transformed into a bustling crime scene. White tents were erected over the excavation area, and forensic technicians in protective suits began their meticulous work. Helena found herself fascinated by the similarities and differences between archaeological and forensic excavation techniques. Dr. Emma Sinclair, the lead forensic pathologist, worked with the same careful precision Helena used when uncovering ancient artifacts. But where Helena sought to understand historical context, Dr. Sinclair was building a timeline of death and burial. Female, approximately 25 to 30 years old, Dr. Sinclair announced as she carefully exposed more of the remains. Based on the clothing and the level of decomposition, I'd estimate she's been here between 25 and 35 years. Helena watched from behind the police tape as Dr. Sinclair continued her examination. The victim wore not just the denim jacket, but jeans and what appeared to be running shoes, a casual outfit that suggested someone young, someone who had been living a normal life before ending up in this medieval ground. Any obvious cause of death? Detective Thornfield asked. Dr. Sinclair paused in her work. I'll need to complete the examination back at the lab, but I can see what appears to be trauma to the skull. Blunt force, most likely. Helena felt a chill run down her spine. Someone had killed this young woman and buried her in ground that had been sacred for over 600 years. The violation felt personal, not just to the victim, but to the site itself. As the afternoon wore on, more evidence emerged. A purse, remarkably well preserved by the clay soil, contained a wallet with identification cards. Helena couldn't see the details from her position behind the tape, but she watched Detective Thornfield's face change as he examined the contents. Dr. Whitmore, he called. Could I speak with you for a moment? Helena ducked under the police tape and joined him beside the forensic tent. His expression was grim. The victim's name was Rebecca Morrison, he said quietly. According to her driving license, she was 26 years old in 1994. There's also a student ID from Cambridge University. Helena felt her breath catch. Cambridge? She might have been studying there when she disappeared. That's what makes this even stranger, Thornfield continued. I've run a preliminary check on missing persons reports from that time period. There's no record of Rebecca Morrison ever being reported missing. How is that possible? I don't know yet. But someone killed a young Cambridge student 30 years ago, buried her in medieval ground, and apparently no one ever looked for her. He paused, studying Helena's face. Dr. Whitmore, I think we're going to need your help with more than just the excavation. As the sun began to set over the monastery ruins, Helena found herself staring at the white forensic tent that now covered what had been her carefully planned excavation square. Somewhere beneath that tent lay Rebecca Morrison, a young woman whose story had been buried for 3 decades. But stories, Helena knew, had a way of surfacing eventually. And this one was just beginning to emerge from the ground. Detective Inspector Marcus Thornfield sat in his cramped office at Cambridgeshire Police Headquarters, surrounded by file boxes that hadn't been opened in decades. The Rebecca Morrison case had officially become his priority, and he was discovering just how much the world had changed since 1994. The missing persons database from that era was a mess of paper files and early computer records that didn't talk to each other. But after 2 days of searching, Thornfield had confirmed his initial finding. Rebecca Morrison had never been reported missing by anyone. That's impossible, said Detective Sergeant Lucy Pemberton, his newly assigned partner on the case. At 28, she was young enough to be comfortable with technology, but experienced enough to understand the complexities of cold cases. Someone always reports a missing person. Family, friends, landlords, employers, someone. Thornfield spread Rebecca's personal effects across his desk. Dr. Sinclair had released them after documenting everything for evidence. The contents of Rebecca's purse painted a picture of a young woman in the middle of her life. Student ID for Cambridge University, where she was pursuing a master's degree in English literature, a part-time job card from a local bookshop, and bank cards showing recent transactions up until October 15, 1994. Look at this, Thornfield said, holding up a small appointment card. Dental cleaning scheduled for October 22, 1994. She was planning for the future. Pemberton leaned over to examine the card. So whatever happened to her occurred between October 15th, when she last used her bank card, and October 22nd, when she missed her dental appointment. Exactly. A week where somehow a graduate student disappeared without anyone noticing. Dr. Helena Whitmore knocked on the doorframe of Thornfield's office. She had agreed to consult on the case, bringing her archaeological expertise to help understand the burial site. Today she wore civilian clothes instead of her usual field gear, and Thornfield was struck by how different she looked outside the dig site. Any luck with the university records? She asked, settling into the chair across from his desk. That's where things get interesting, Thornfield replied. He pulled out a folder marked Cambridge University Student Records. Rebecca Morrison was enrolled in a master's program in English literature, just like her ID indicated. But according to the university, she simply stopped attending classes in mid-October 1994. What did they do about it? Helena asked. Nothing, Pemberton answered. The registrar's office sent a few letters to her last known address asking about her enrollment status, but when they didn't get a response, they assumed she had dropped out. Apparently, it wasn't uncommon for graduate students to leave without formally withdrawing. Helena frowned. But didn't anyone miss her? Classmates, professors? Thornfield had wondered the same thing. I spoke with Dr. Margaret Ashford, who was Rebecca's thesis supervisor. She's retired now, but she remembered Rebecca well. Said she was a dedicated student working on a thesis about medieval religious manuscripts. Medieval manuscripts? Helena looked surprised. That's remarkably close to my own area of expertise. Dr. Ashford said Rebecca had been spending a lot of time in the university library's special collections, researching manuscripts from local monasteries, including St. Bartholomew's. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Rebecca Morrison had been researching the very monastery where her body was found 30 years later. That can't be a coincidence, Pemberton said. I don't believe in coincidences, Thornfield replied. Helena, is it possible Rebecca visited your dig site while she was working on her research? Helena shook her head. There was no dig site in 1994. The monastery ruins were only discovered last year when farmer William Hartley was expanding his field. Before that, the location was completely unknown. So how did Rebecca end up buried there? Pemberton asked. Thornfield stood up and walked to the window overlooking the Cambridge streets. Maybe the killer knew about the monastery ruins, even when they were still buried. Someone with knowledge of local history, or someone who had access to historical records that others didn't. Helena's eyes lit up with understanding. Medieval monastery sites were often documented in property records, even after the buildings were destroyed. Someone researching local history might have known exactly where the monastery once stood. Someone like Rebecca herself, Pemberton suggested quietly. Thornfield turned back to them. You think she was killed by someone she met through her research? It's possible, Helena said. If she was working on medieval manuscripts, she would have been in contact with historians, archaeologists, local researchers, maybe even amateur treasure hunters. Thornfield made a note to investigate Rebecca's research contacts. What about her personal life? We still haven't found anyone who reported her missing. Pemberton consulted her notes. I tracked down her last known address, a small flat near the university. The landlord from 1994 is still alive. He said Rebecca paid her rent through October, then simply disappeared. He waited a month, then cleared out her belongings and relet the flat. What happened to her belongings? Donated to charity, most likely. This was 30 years ago. He couldn't remember the details. Helena leaned forward. What about family? Parents, siblings. That's where it gets even stranger, Thornfield said. Rebecca's university application listed her next of kin as her aunt, Margaret Morrison, in Edinburgh. But when I contacted the Scottish authorities, they told me Margaret Morrison died in 1993, a year before Rebecca disappeared. So Rebecca had no family at all? It appears that way. Her parents died in a car accident when she was 18. Margaret Morrison was her only relative, and she died while Rebecca was in her first year of graduate school. The picture that emerged was heartbreaking. A brilliant young woman, alone in the world, whose disappearance went unnoticed because there was no one left to notice. We need to understand her final weeks, Thornfield said. Who she was meeting with, what she was working on, where she was going. Helena stood up. I can help with the academic side. I'll contact the library's Special Collections Department and see what records they have of Rebecca's research. If she was accessing manuscript collections, there should be request forms, maybe notes about what she was looking for. Good thinking, Thornfield agreed. Pemberton, I want you to track down anyone who worked at that bookshop where Rebecca had a part-time job. Someone there might remember her final days. As Helena left the police station, her mind was racing. The connection between Rebecca's research and the monastery site was too significant to ignore. But it raised a troubling question. Had Rebecca been killed because of what she was researching, or because of what she had discovered? The next morning, Helena found herself in the basement archives of Cambridge University Library, surrounded by dusty filing cabinets and boxes of old request forms. The Special Collections librarian, an elderly man named Dr. Geoffrey Blackwood, had worked there for over 40 years and remembered Rebecca Morrison well. Brilliant girl, he said, pulling out a box marked 1994 manuscript requests. Very focused on her research, but there was something intense about her toward the end. Intense how? Helena asked, flipping through request forms until she found Rebecca's name. She was requesting more and more obscure documents. At first, she was looking at standard medieval religious texts, But then she started asking for property records, monastery financial documents, things that weren't really related to her thesis topic. Helena found Rebecca's request forms and spread them across the reading table. Dr. Blackwood was right. There was a clear progression from academic research to something more investigative. "Look at this," Helena said, pointing to a request form dated October 10, 1994. She requested the complete property records for the Hartley farm, including historical surveys dating back to the 16th century. "That's exactly what I mean," Dr. Blackwood said. "Why would a student researching medieval manuscripts need modern property records?" Helena studied the forms more carefully. Rebecca's final library visit had been October 14, 1994, just one day before her last recorded bank transaction. She had requested a document that made Helena's pulse quicken. Archaeological survey notes, St. Bartholomew's Monastery site, prepared by Charles Hartley, 1987. "Dr. Blackwood," Helena said urgently, "do you still have this document?" The librarian consulted his catalog. "It should be in the local history collection." Charles Hartley was the father of the current farmer, William Hartley. He was an amateur historian who spent years researching his property. 20 minutes later, Helena was reading Charles Hartley's handwritten notes about the monastery ruins buried beneath his farm. The amateur historian had used old maps and property records to pinpoint the exact location of the medieval buildings. His notes even included a rough sketch showing where he believed the main chapel and burial grounds were located. Helena's hands trembled as she realized what this meant. Rebecca Morrison hadn't just known about the monastery ruins, she had known exactly where they were buried. And she had been the last person to access Charles Hartley's notes before disappearing forever. Someone had killed Rebecca Morrison to keep her from revealing what she had discovered. But what could a medieval monastery site hold that was worth murder? Helena reached for her phone to call Detective Thornfield. The case had just taken a much darker turn. Detective Thornfield stood in William Hartley's farmhouse kitchen, watching the farmer's weathered hands shake as he poured tea. The morning light streamed through windows that overlooked the field where Rebecca Morrison's body had been found, and Thornfield could see the white forensic tent still covering the excavation site. "I never knew about my father's research," William said, settling into a chair across from Thornfield and Helena. "Found his papers when I was cleaning out the attic after he died in 2019. Boxes and boxes of old maps and documents about this place." Helena placed Charles Hartley's archaeological notes on the kitchen table. "Your father was remarkably thorough. These notes show he had pinpointed the exact location of the monastery ruins decades before we officially discovered them." William examined his father's handwriting with sad eyes. "Dad was always fascinated by history. Spent hours walking these fields, collecting bits of old pottery and stone. I thought it was just a hobby." "Did he ever mention meeting with university researchers?" Thornfield asked. "Someone who might have been interested in his findings?" William shook his head slowly. "Dad was a bit of a loner after Mum died. Kept to himself mostly. But..." He paused, his brow furrowing with concentration. "But what?" Helena prompted gently. "There was something he said before he died. He was in hospital, confused from the medications, but he kept talking about the girl who asked too many questions. I thought he was just rambling." Thornfield felt his pulse quicken. "Can you remember anything else he said about this girl?" "He said she came to the farm one day asking about the old monastery. Said she had read his research at the university and wanted to see the site for herself." William's eyes widened as understanding dawned. "You think he meant the girl you found buried out there?" "It's possible," Thornfield said carefully. "Do you remember anything else about what your father said?" William was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the field where his family had farmed for 3 generations. "He said he showed her where he thought the monastery was buried. Said she got very excited about something and asked if she could come back with equipment to take measurements." Helena and Thornfield exchanged glances. "Did she come back?" Helena asked. That's what's strange, William continued. Dad said she promised to return the following week, but she never did. He waited for her, even prepared a fresh pot of tea that Saturday morning. When she didn't show up, he figured she had found what she needed elsewhere. Thornfield made notes as William spoke. Rebecca Morrison had visited the Hartley farm sometime in early October 1994, learned the exact location of the monastery ruins, and arranged to return. But instead of coming back for her follow-up visit, she had ended up buried in the very ground she had been so eager to study. Mr. Hartley, Helena said, did your father ever mention finding anything unusual on his property? Artifacts, structures, anything that might have been valuable? William shook his head. Just the usual farming debris, old horseshoes, pottery fragments, that sort of thing. Nothing worth getting excited about. After leaving the Hartley farm, Thornfield drove Helena back to the monastery site. The police had released most of the excavation area back to her team, keeping only the immediate burial site cordoned off for ongoing forensic work. What do you think Rebecca discovered that got her killed? Thornfield asked as they walked among the medieval foundation stones. Helena surveyed the site with new eyes, trying to see it as Rebecca might have 30 years ago. Medieval monasteries were often repositories of wealth, not just religious artifacts, but important documents, precious metals, sometimes even hidden treasures that were buried during times of political upheaval. You think there's treasure buried here? It's possible. The dissolution of the monasteries under Henry VIII was a violent time. Many monks hid their most precious possessions rather than surrender them to the crown. Helena knelt beside a partially excavated wall. But Rebecca was a literature student, not a treasure hunter. She would have been more interested in manuscripts and documents. Thornfield considered this. Unless she found something that someone else wanted very badly. Helena's assistant, James Crawford, approached them with a puzzled expression. Dr. Whitmore, I hate to interrupt, but we've found something odd. He led them to the eastern section of the site, where the team had been carefully exposing what appeared to be a small stone chamber. We thought this was just another storage room, James explained, but look at this. Helena examined the stonework around the chamber entrance. Unlike the rest of the monastery walls, this section showed signs of much more recent disturbance. This has been opened before, she said with certainty. Recently? How recently? Thornfield asked. Helena ran her fingers along the mortar between the stones. It's hard to say exactly, but this mortar is definitely not original medieval work. Someone has broken into this chamber and then resealed it within the last 30 or 40 years. Thornfield felt pieces of the puzzle beginning to click together in his mind. Rebecca Morrison discovers the location of the monastery ruins through Charles Hartley's research. She comes to examine the site and finds evidence that someone has already been digging here, probably looking for valuable artifacts or documents. And whoever was doing the illegal excavation killed her to protect their secret, Helena finished. James had been listening with growing excitement. Should we open the chamber? See what's inside. Helena looked at Thornfield, who nodded. This is officially part of a murder investigation now. Whatever's in there might be evidence. It took the better part of the afternoon to carefully remove the stones blocking the chamber entrance. As the opening widened, Helena could see that the small room had indeed been thoroughly searched by someone who cared little for archaeological protocol. The floor was littered with broken pottery and scattered stones, suggesting a hasty and destructive treasure hunt. But in the far corner of the chamber, partially hidden under fallen debris, Helena spotted something that made her heart race. There, she said, pointing with her trowel. Under those stones. Thornfield helped her carefully move the debris, revealing a wooden box that had somehow been overlooked by whoever had ransacked the chamber. The wood was dark with age and moisture, but the box remained intact. Helena lifted it gently and carried it out into the afternoon sunlight. The box was surprisingly heavy for its size, and something shifted inside when she moved it. "Should we open it here?" she asked. Thornfield considered the options. "Let's take it back to the station. If this is evidence in Rebecca's murder, we need to document everything properly." 2 hours later, in the controlled environment of the police station's evidence room, Helena carefully opened the medieval wooden box, while Thornfield and Dr. Sinclair documented every step of the process. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth that had preserved them remarkably well, were 3 illuminated manuscripts. Even in the artificial light of the evidence room, the gold leaf and brilliant colors seemed to glow with their own inner fire. "These are extraordinary," Helena whispered, barely daring to breathe on the ancient parchment. "Medieval manuscripts of this quality are priceless. Museum pieces." Dr. Sinclair leaned in for a closer look. "How priceless are we talking about?" Helena carefully examined the manuscripts without touching them. Each of these could be worth hundreds of thousands of pounds. Together, they represent a fortune. "Enough to kill for?" Thornfield asked. "Definitely." But as Helena studied the manuscripts more closely, she noticed something that changed everything. Tucked between the pages of the largest manuscript was a piece of modern paper, a handwritten note in what appeared to be Rebecca Morrison's careful script. Thornfield carefully extracted the note with tweezers and read it aloud. October 12, 1994. Found evidence of illegal excavation at Monastery site. Charles H. confirms his map's accurate. Someone has been treasure hunting here for years. Have photographed manuscripts in hidden chamber before reporting to authorities. If something happens to me, the answer is in the medieval music. Medieval music? Helena repeated, puzzled. Thornfield studied the note carefully. She knew she was in danger. This was her insurance policy. But what did she mean about medieval music? Helena looked back at the manuscripts spread before them. One of them was different from the others. Instead of religious texts, it appeared to be a collection of musical notations and songs. "Wait," she said suddenly. "Look at this manuscript more carefully." She pointed to the musical manuscript, where tiny notes had been written in the margins in what appeared to be modern pencil. Rebecca added notes to a priceless medieval manuscript. She was trying to tell us something. Thornfield examined the penciled notes through a magnifying glass. They appeared to be names and dates, written in Rebecca's careful handwriting. At the top of the page, almost invisible unless you knew to look for it, was a name that made Thornfield's blood run cold. "Geoffrey Blackwood," he read aloud. "The librarian we spoke with yesterday." Helena felt the pieces falling into place. Dr. Blackwood had access to all the historical research, including Charles Hartley's notes about the monastery location. He knew about Rebecca's investigation because she was requesting documents from his collection. "And he's been systematically looting the monastery site for years," Thornfield added. "When Rebecca got too close to the truth, he killed her and buried her at the very site he'd been robbing." But even as the case seemed to be solving itself, Thornfield couldn't shake the feeling that they were still missing something important. Rebecca Morrison had been clever enough to leave behind evidence that pointed to her killer, but she had also hidden that evidence in plain sight for 30 years. Why hadn't anyone found it before now? The answer, when it came to him, was as disturbing as it was elegant. Dr. Geoffrey Blackwood hadn't just killed Rebecca Morrison to protect his treasure hunting operation. He had been systematically ensuring that no one else would ever find the evidence she had left behind. Until now, when Helena's archaeological dig had accidentally uncovered a 30-year-old murder and the secret that died with it. The next morning brought a cold rain that drummed against the windows of Cambridge University Library. Detective Thornfield sat in his car across the street from the building, watching Dr. Geoffrey Blackwood arrive for work exactly as he had for the past 40 years. The elderly librarian moved slowly up the stone steps, hunched under an umbrella, looking like nothing more than a harmless academic approaching retirement. Helena sat in the passenger seat, studying photographs of Rebecca's annotated musical manuscript. "I've been thinking about this all night," she said. The names Rebecca wrote in the margins. They're not random. Thornfield looked at the photos spread across Helena's lap. Rebecca had penciled in 5 names along the edges of the medieval musical notation: Geoffrey Blackwood, Charles Hartley, Margaret Ashford, Thomas Whitfield, and David Crane. "We know about Blackwood and Charles Hartley," Thornfield said. Margaret Ashford was Rebecca's thesis supervisor. But who are Thomas Whitfield and David Crane? "That's what I figured out," Helena said with excitement. "I ran the names through university databases going back to the 1990s. Thomas Whitfield was a graduate student in medieval history who left Cambridge abruptly in October 1994, the same month Rebecca disappeared." Thornfield felt his pulse quicken. "Left how?" "According to university records, he simply stopped attending classes and never returned. No forwarding address, no explanation. Just like Rebecca, except no one reported him missing either." "Another victim?" "Possibly. But David Crane is even more interesting." Helena pulled out a photocopy of an old university staff directory. David Crane worked as a research assistant in the library's Special Collections Department in 1994. He was Geoffrey Blackwood's subordinate. The pieces of the conspiracy were becoming clearer. So we potentially have a librarian and his assistant running an artifact theft operation, using university resources to identify valuable sites like the Monastery. And when Rebecca got too close to their operation, they killed her, Helena continued. But they might have killed Thomas Whitfield too, if he was also investigating the same leads. Thornfield started the car. "We need to find out what happened to Thomas Whitfield. If he's another victim, there might be a second burial site. Or he might still be alive," Helena suggested. "If he discovered the conspiracy but managed to escape before they could silence him." Their first stop was Detective Sergeant Pemberton's desk at police headquarters. She had been working since dawn, tracking down information about the mysterious Thomas Whitfield. "Found him," she announced as soon as Thornfield and Helena walked in. Thomas Whitfield, now 62 years old, living in a small village in the Lake District. He changed his name to Thomas White after leaving Cambridge and has been working as a freelance historical researcher ever since. Changed his name. Thornfield raised an eyebrow. "That sounds like someone running from something." Pemberton nodded. "I called him this morning. He was very reluctant to talk at first, but when I mentioned Rebecca Morrison's name, he agreed to meet with us. He said he's been waiting 30 years for someone to ask the right questions." 2 hours later, Thornfield and Helena were sitting in the cozy living room of a Lake District cottage, listening to Thomas White tell a story that had been buried for 3 decades. "Rebecca and I were both researching medieval manuscripts," Thomas began, his hands shaking slightly as he poured tea. "We met in the library and realized we were investigating some of the same sites. Rebecca was brilliant. She had an intuitive understanding of how medieval monks would have hidden their most precious possessions." "You were working together?" Helena asked. Thomas nodded. "Informally, yes. We shared research notes and compared findings. Rebecca had discovered something extraordinary about the St. Bartholomew's Monastery site, but she was concerned about Dr. Blackwood's interest in her work." "What kind of interest?" Thornfield inquired. "He was asking too many questions about her research, wanting to see her notes, suggesting locations she might want to investigate. At first, Rebecca thought he was just being helpful, but then she started noticing that sites she had identified were being disturbed by unauthorized excavations." Thomas stood up and walked to his bookshelf, pulling out a battered notebook. "Rebecca asked me to keep copies of her research notes, just in case something happened to her original work. She was getting paranoid in those final weeks." He handed the notebook to Helena, who opened it to find detailed maps, photographs, and observations about various historical sites around Cambridge. Rebecca's handwriting filled every page with meticulous documentation of her discoveries. "Look at this," Helena said, pointing to an entry dated October 10, 1994. Rebecca documented finding fresh excavation marks at 3 different monastery sites around Cambridge. Someone was systematically looting these locations. That's when we realized Dr. Blackwood wasn't just helping with our research, Thomas continued. He was using our work to guide his own treasure hunting operation. We started keeping our real discoveries secret from him. Thornfield leaned forward. What happened the week Rebecca disappeared? Thomas's face darkened. Rebecca had arranged to meet with Dr. Blackwood on October 15th to show him some false research that would lead him away from the real monastery site. She was going to confront him about the looting and threaten to expose him unless he stopped. She was planning to blackmail him? Not for money, Thomas said quickly. She wanted to preserve the sites for proper archaeological study. Rebecca believed these locations held important historical documents that could change our understanding of medieval England. Helena looked up from the notebook. What documents? Thomas walked to another bookshelf and retrieved a manila folder. This is what Rebecca was really after. Not treasure in the traditional sense, but something far more valuable to historians. He opened the folder to reveal photocopies of medieval manuscripts that appeared to be written in a mixture of Latin and Old English. Rebecca believed the monasteries around Cambridge had been repositories for Anglo-Saxon chronicles that were thought to be lost forever. Historical documents that could rewrite our understanding of early English history. Thornfield studied the manuscript copies. These are what got her killed? Dr. Blackwood wasn't just stealing artifacts to sell them, Thomas explained. He was building a private collection of the most important historical documents in England. Documents that officially don't exist. Helena felt a chill run down her spine. He was stealing history itself. Exactly. And Rebecca was about to expose him. Thomas sat back down, his face grave with the weight of 30-year-old memories. The night before she disappeared, Rebecca called me. She was terrified. She said she had found proof that Dr. Blackwood had been systematically removing rare manuscripts from the university collection and replacing them with forgeries. Thornfield made notes as Thomas spoke. What kind of proof? Rebecca had discovered discrepancies in the library's catalog system. Manuscripts that were supposedly on loan to other institutions had never actually left Cambridge. Dr. Blackwood was creating false records to cover his thefts. Why didn't you go to the police when Rebecca disappeared? Thornfield asked. Thomas's hands trembled as he set down his teacup. Because I was a coward. The day after Rebecca vanished, I received a visit from David Crane, Dr. Blackwood's assistant. He told me that Rebecca had been in an accident and that I should forget about our research project. When I asked for details about the accident, he became threatening. Threatening how? He said that graduate students who asked too many questions about Dr. Blackwood's work had a tendency to leave Cambridge unexpectedly. He suggested I might want to consider transferring to another university for my own safety. Helena looked up from Rebecca's notebook. So you ran. I packed my belongings that night and left Cambridge the next morning. Changed my name, moved as far away as I could, and never looked back. Thomas's voice was filled with shame. I told myself that Rebecca had probably just run away too, that she had gotten scared and decided to disappear. I knew it wasn't true, but it was easier than admitting I was abandoning her. Thornfield studied the man sitting across from him. Thomas White had lived with guilt and fear for 30 years, knowing that his cowardice might have cost Rebecca Morrison her life. But he had also preserved evidence that could finally bring her killer to justice. Mr. White, Thornfield said gently, you said Rebecca was planning to confront Dr. Blackwood on October 15th. Do you know where they were supposed to meet? Thomas nodded. She was going to meet him at the monastery site. She wanted to show him the empty chamber where the manuscripts had been hidden, to prove that someone had already looted the location. But Dr. Blackwood already knew the chamber was empty, Helena realized. Because he was the one who had emptied it. Which means the meeting was a trap, Thornfield concluded. Dr. Blackwood knew Rebecca was onto him, so he agreed to meet her at an isolated location where he could kill her without witnesses. Thomas reached into his folder and pulled out one final document. There's something else. Rebecca gave me this the last time I saw her alive. He handed Thornfield a sealed envelope with insurance written across the front in Rebecca's handwriting. Inside was a letter addressed to the Cambridge police, dated October 14, 1994. Thornfield read the letter aloud. To whom it may concern, if you are reading this letter, it means something has happened to me in connection with my investigation into thefts at Cambridge University Library. Dr. Jeffrey Blackwood has been systematically stealing rare manuscripts and replacing them with forgeries. I have documented evidence of his crimes hidden in the medieval music manuscript, currently stored in the Special Collections Vault, catalog number SCM 1147. The evidence includes photographs of the stolen documents and records of their true locations. I believe Dr. Blackwood has discovered my investigation and may attempt to silence me. Please ensure this information reaches the proper authorities. Rebecca Morrison, October 14, 1994. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Rebecca had not only documented Dr. Blackwood's crimes, but she had hidden the evidence in the very manuscript collection he was supposed to be protecting. We need to get back to Cambridge immediately, Thornfield said, standing up. If that evidence is still in the library, we can finally prove what happened to Rebecca. Helena was already gathering up the notebooks and documents. But why didn't anyone find the evidence before now? Surely other researchers have accessed that manuscript over the past 30 years. Thomas smiled grimly. Because Dr. Blackwood controls access to the special collections, he could ensure that no one ever requested that particular manuscript. And even if they did, he could claim it was damaged or unavailable. As they prepared to leave the Lake District cottage, Thornfield turned back to Thomas. Will you come with us? We may need your testimony to make this case stick. Thomas hesitated for a moment, then nodded with determination. I've been hiding from this for 30 years. It's time I helped Rebecca get the justice she deserves. Cambridge University Library stood against the darkening sky like a fortress of knowledge, its Gothic towers silhouetted by the setting sun. Detective Thornfield approached the building with Helena, Thomas, and a team of forensic specialists, all of them carrying court orders that would allow them to examine every document in Dr. Blackwood's care. Inside the Special Collections reading room, Dr. Blackwood sat behind his familiar desk, seemingly absorbed in cataloging a stack of medieval manuscripts. He looked up with mild curiosity as the group entered, but Thornfield noticed the slight tremor in his hands as he set down his pen. Dr. Blackwood, Thornfield announced, we have a warrant to search these premises in connection with the murder of Rebecca Morrison. For a moment, the elderly librarian's composed mask slipped, revealing something cold and calculating beneath. Then he recovered, standing up with the dignity of a man who had spent 40 years commanding respect in academic circles. I'm afraid I don't understand, Dr. Blackwood said carefully. Rebecca Morrison was a graduate student who left the university many years ago. I fail to see how her departure could be connected to a murder investigation. Helena stepped forward, carrying a folder containing photocopies of Rebecca's hidden notes. We know about the thefts, Dr. Blackwood. We know about the forgeries, the false catalog entries, and the systematic looting of monastery sites around Cambridge. Dr. Blackwood's eyes flickered to Thomas, and recognition dawned on his face. Thomas Whitfield. I wondered when you might resurface. It's Thomas White now, Thomas replied with quiet strength. I changed my name to escape from you. But I never forgot what you did to Rebecca. Thornfield watched the interplay between the three academics, noting how Dr. Blackwood's demeanor shifted from confusion to resignation. The man was too intelligent to maintain his pretense when faced with evidence and witnesses. I'd like to see manuscript SCM 1147, Helena announced, consulting Rebecca's letter. The medieval music collection. Dr. Blackwood hesitated for just a moment too long. I'm afraid that manuscript is currently being restored. It's not available for viewing. Then we'll wait while you retrieve it from restoration, Thornfield said firmly. 20 minutes later, Dr. Blackwood returned with a leather-bound manuscript that appeared to be in perfect condition. He placed it carefully on the reading table, but Thornfield noticed the man's hands were now visibly shaking. Helena opened the manuscript with gloved hands, carefully turning pages of medieval musical notation until she reached the section where Rebecca had hidden her evidence. But the pages were blank. No penciled notes, no hidden photographs, no documentation of Dr. Blackwood's crimes. Someone has altered this manuscript, Helena said with certainty. The pages have been cleaned and treated to remove modern annotations. Dr. Blackwood managed a weak smile. Medieval manuscripts require constant conservation. Perhaps any modern editions were removed as part of routine preservation, but Thomas was studying the manuscript more closely. This isn't the same book, he said suddenly. The binding is similar, but the actual manuscript is different. Rebecca and I studied this collection extensively. I know every illuminated letter, every musical phrase. This is a forgery. Thornfield felt the case slipping away. If Dr. Blackwood had replaced the evidence with a forgery, they would have no proof of Rebecca's discoveries or her documentation of his crimes. Then Helena noticed something that changed everything. Wait, she said, examining the manuscript's binding more closely. Look at this. She pointed to tiny holes along the edge of the binding, barely visible unless you knew to look for them. These are pin marks. Someone has removed pages from this manuscript and then rebound it to hide the gaps. Thornfield called over one of the forensic specialists, who confirmed Helena's observation. The manuscript had been carefully altered, with several pages removed, and the binding reconstructed to conceal the theft. Dr. Blackwood, Thornfield said, where are the missing pages from this manuscript? The elderly librarian's composure finally cracked completely. He sank into his chair, suddenly looking every one of his 73 years. You don't understand, he said quietly. I wasn't stealing for personal gain. I was preserving history. By committing murder? Thornfield asked. Dr. Blackwood looked up with eyes that held 3 decades of rationalization and guilt. Rebecca didn't understand the larger picture. She was going to expose everything, destroy years of careful work to preserve England's most precious historical documents. Helena leaned forward. Preserve them where? In your private collection. In a place where they would be properly cared for, properly studied by people who truly understood their value. Dr. Blackwood's voice took on the fervor of a true believer. The university system is bureaucratic, political. Important documents get buried in committees and red tape. I was ensuring they received the attention they deserved. Thomas stood up, anger finally overcoming 30 years of fear. You were stealing them. And when Rebecca threatened to expose you, you killed her. It wasn't supposed to happen that way, Dr. Blackwood said, his voice barely above a whisper. I asked her to meet me at the monastery site to discuss her concerns. I thought I could convince her to join my work, to understand the importance of what I was doing. But she refused, Thornfield prompted. Dr. Blackwood nodded slowly. She called me a thief and a vandal. Said she was going to report everything to the police the next morning. We argued, and she turned to walk away. And you hit her, Helena finished. It was an accident, Dr. Blackwood said desperately. I grabbed a piece of the old monastery stone to emphasize my point, and when she kept walking away, I struck out in frustration. I never meant to kill her. Thornfield felt the familiar mixture of satisfaction and sadness that came with solving a decades-old case. The truth was finally emerging, but it couldn't bring Rebecca Morrison back to life. What happened after you killed her? Thornfield asked. Dr. Blackwood stared at his hands, which had once carefully preserved ancient documents and had also taken a young woman's life. I panicked. I couldn't leave her body there. It would have led investigators directly to the monastery site and my excavations. So I buried her in the location where I had been working. And you've been protecting that secret for 30 years. David Crane helped me, Dr. Blackwood admitted. He had been assisting with my research and excavations. When I told him what had happened, he helped me ensure that no one would investigate Rebecca's disappearance too closely. Helena looked up sharply. Where is David Crane now? Dr. Blackwood's expression became even more haunted. David died in a car accident in 1995. He had been drinking heavily since Rebecca's death, consumed with guilt. I always believed he deliberately drove into that tree. The room fell silent as the full scope of the tragedy became clear. Rebecca Morrison's murder had destroyed multiple lives, created decades of guilt and fear, and robbed the academic world of a brilliant young researcher. Dr. Blackwood, Thornfield said formally, "You are under arrest for the murder of Rebecca Morrison." As the handcuffs clicked into place, the elderly librarian looked around the reading room that had been his domain for 4 decades. "The manuscripts," he said urgently. "My collection, it needs to be properly preserved. Promise me the documents will be cared for." Helena felt a mixture of pity and disgust for the man who had justified murder in the name of historical preservation. "Where are the stolen manuscripts, Dr. Blackwood? Where did you hide Rebecca's evidence?" The old man was silent for a long moment, then gave them an address in a quiet Cambridge neighborhood. "My house," he said simply. "Everything is in my house." 1 week later, Helena stood in the basement of Dr. Blackwood's modest Cambridge home, surrounded by the largest private collection of stolen medieval manuscripts she had ever seen. The forensic team had cataloged over 200 documents, many of them thought to be lost forever, carefully preserved in climate-controlled cases that represented decades of meticulous theft. Detective Thornfield joined her in the basement, carrying a folder containing the final pieces of evidence that would close Rebecca Morrison's case forever. Among Dr. Blackwood's possessions, investigators had found Rebecca's original research notes, photographs of the looted monastery sites, and, most importantly, the missing pages from the medieval music manuscript where she had documented her discoveries. The Crown Prosecution Service says it's one of the strongest murder cases they've seen, Thornfield reported. Dr. Blackwood's confession, combined with the physical evidence and witness testimony, should ensure a conviction even 30 years after the crime. Helena picked up one of Rebecca's photographs, which showed the St. Bartholomew's monastery chamber before Dr. Blackwood had ransacked it. The image revealed manuscripts and artifacts arranged exactly as medieval monks had left them centuries earlier, a pristine archaeological site that had been destroyed by greed. She was so close to making one of the most significant historical discoveries of the century, Helena said sadly. These Anglo-Saxon chronicles could have changed our understanding of early English history. Will the manuscripts be returned to the university? Thornfield asked. Helena nodded. Most of them, yes, though it will take years to properly catalog everything and determine which documents came from which collections. She paused, looking around the basement that had served as Dr. Blackwood's private museum. The irony is that he was right about one thing. These documents do need proper care and study. He just went about preserving them in the worst possible way. Thornfield's phone buzzed with a text message. That's Thomas White. He's driving down from the Lake District for Rebecca's memorial service tomorrow. The memorial service was held at Cambridge University, in the same chapel where Rebecca had attended lectures 30 years earlier. The small gathering included Helena's archaeological team, Detective Thornfield and Sergeant Pemberton, Thomas White, and a handful of Rebecca's former classmates who had finally learned what happened to their missing colleague. Dr. Margaret Ashford, Rebecca's former thesis supervisor, now in her 70s, spoke about the young woman's passion for medieval history and her dedication to uncovering the truth about the past. Rebecca believed that history belongs to everyone, Dr. Ashford said, her voice carrying across the ancient stone chapel. She would have been horrified to learn that her own story became a hidden piece of history, buried for 3 decades. After the service, Helena and Thornfield walked together through the Cambridge streets where Rebecca Morrison had lived and studied and ultimately died. The case was officially closed. Dr. Blackwood was awaiting trial, and the stolen manuscripts were being returned to their proper repositories. But Thornfield couldn't shake the feeling that Rebecca's story was still incomplete. She was 26 years old, he said as they paused outside the bookshop where Rebecca had worked part-time. Brilliant, dedicated, passionate about her research. What would she have accomplished if she had lived? Helena considered the question. She would have become one of the leading medieval scholars in England. Her work on monastery sites was already groundbreaking, even as a graduate student. They continued walking until they reached the field where the St. Bartholomew's Monastery ruins lay exposed to the sky for the first time in centuries. Helena's team had resumed their archaeological work, now with the added knowledge of which areas had been previously disturbed by Dr. Blackwood's illegal excavations. "We're going to complete Rebecca's research," Helena announced. Her notes contained enough information to guide a proper archaeological study of the monastery site. "We'll publish our findings in her name." Thornfield smiled at the idea. "She'll finally get credit for her discoveries." "More than that," Helena replied. "We're establishing the Rebecca Morrison Memorial Foundation for Medieval Studies. It will fund research into monastery sites around England, ensuring that future discoveries are properly preserved and studied." As the sun set over the ancient monastery ruins, Helena thought about the young woman whose curiosity had led to both her death and, ultimately, her vindication. Rebecca Morrison had been silenced for 30 years, but her voice was finally being heard again through the scholars who would continue her work. The archaeological dig would take several more months to complete, but Helena already knew they would find remarkable things in the ground that Rebecca had been so eager to explore. Medieval manuscripts, religious artifacts, and glimpses into a world that had been hidden for centuries. But the most important discovery had already been made: the truth about what happened to a brilliant young researcher who had asked too many questions and paid the ultimate price for her curiosity. Dr. Geoffrey Blackwood was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison, though at 73, he would likely spend his remaining years contemplating the irony that his attempt to preserve history had instead destroyed it. The stolen manuscripts were gradually returned to their rightful collections, where they would be properly studied by scholars who understood that some things are too precious to be hoarded. Thomas White returned to his quiet life in the Lake District, but not before establishing a scholarship at Cambridge University for students researching medieval history. He had finally found a way to honor Rebecca's memory and atone for 30 years of silence. Helena often thought about Rebecca Morrison as she continued the excavation work at St. Bartholomew's Monastery. Each artifact they uncovered, each piece of the medieval puzzle they assembled, was a testament to the young woman's passion for understanding the past. In the end, Rebecca had achieved her goal of preserving history for future generations. She had just paid a higher price for that achievement than anyone should have to pay. The monastery ruins stood as a monument not just to the medieval monks who had once lived there, but to a young archaeologist's dedication to uncovering the truth. Rebecca Morrison's story had become part of the site's history, another layer in the complex tapestry of human experience that archaeologists spend their lives trying to understand. And in the quiet moments when Helena worked alone in the excavation site, carefully brushing soil away from artifacts that had waited centuries to see daylight again, she could almost feel Rebecca's presence, a reminder that the search for truth, no matter how dangerous, is always worth pursuing. The past, Helena had learned, has a way of surfacing eventually. Sometimes it takes 30 years, sometimes longer, but the truth always finds a way to emerge from the ground where it was buried. Rebecca Morrison had waited 3 decades for justice, but she had finally received it. Her story would be remembered, her research would be completed, and her name would be honored by future generations of scholars who understood that history is too important to be stolen or silenced. In death, Rebecca had achieved a kind of immortality that her killer could never take away, the immortality that comes from making a difference in the world, even when that difference isn't recognized until long after the person is gone. The archaeologist's discovery had become something more than just a crime to be solved. It had become a reminder that every life has value, every voice deserves to be heard, and every truth, no matter how deeply buried, will eventually find its way back to the light. The end. We encourage you to like and subscribe to our channel if you enjoyed the video. Please share your thoughts in the comments section and explore our channel for a diverse range of content, including audiobooks, murder mysteries, psychological thrillers, and classic novels. We strive to provide comprehensive and engaging storytelling experiences. Your visit is highly appreciated, and we are confident you will find content to your liking.